This is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump formally accepted the Republican Party's nomination Thursday night before a crowd of about 1,500 people on the South Lawn of the White House. In defiance of social distancing rules, attendees sat shoulder to shoulder. Few wore masks. Trump spoke as the U.S. death toll from the coronavirus neared 180,000, by far the highest total in the world. About the same number of people sat in front of him as die every day in the United States of coronavirus. During his speech, Trump repeatedly defended his administration's handling of the pandemic.
The United States is among the lowest case fatality rates of any major country anywhere in the world. The European Union's case fatality rate is nearly 3 times higher than ours, but you don't hear that. They don't write about that. They don't want to write about that. They don't want you to know those things.
In fact, the U.S. has the highest total death toll in the world. With a little over 4% of the world's population, the U.S. has about 25% of the world's coronavirus deaths. 120 nations have a lower case fatality rate than the United States. CNN reports this was one of the more than 20 false or misleading statements in Trump's acceptance speech. Earlier in the day, Democratic vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris delivered a pre-rebuttal to Trump's speech and attacked his handling of the coronavirus outbreak.
Donald Trump has failed at the most basic and important job of a president of the United States. He failed to protect the American people. Plain and simple. Trump showed that we in the legal profession would call a reckless disregard for the well-being of the American people. A reckless disregard.
During his acceptance speech, President Trump made no reference to the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or the killing of the 2 protesters in Kenosha by a 17-year-old white militia Trump supporter.
When there is police misconduct, the justice system must hold wrongdoers fully and completely accountable, and it will. But when we can never have a situation where things are going on as they are today, we must never allow mob rule. We can never allow mob rule. In the strongest possible terms, the Republican Party condemns the rioting, looting, arson, and violence we have seen in Democrat-run cities all, like Kenosha, Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, and New York, and many others, Democrat-run. There is violence and danger in the streets of many Democrat-run cities throughout America.
During her pre-rebuttal, Kamala Harris directly addressed the police shooting of Jacob Blake and other incidents of police violence.
As Vice President Biden put it, the shots fired at Mr. Blake pierced the soul of our nation. It's sickening to watch. It's all too familiar. People are rightfully angry and exhausted. And after the murders of Breonna and George and Ahmaud and so many others, it's no wonder people are taken to the streets. And I support them. We must always defend peaceful protest and peaceful protesters. We should not confuse them with those looting and committing acts of violence.
During Trump's acceptance speech, he mentioned Joe Biden's name, about 41 times. He attacked him repeatedly, claiming he was a Trojan horse for socialism and a threat to the American dream.
Biden is a Trojan horse for socialism. If Joe Biden doesn't have the strength to stand up to wild-eyed Marxists like Bernie Sanders and his fellow radicals, and there are many, we see them all the time, it's incredible actually, then how is he ever going to stand up for you? He's not. Make no mistake, if you give power to Joe Biden, the radical left will defund police departments all across America. They will pass federal legislation to reduce law enforcement nationwide. They will make every city look like Democrat-run Portland, Oregon. No one will be safe in Biden's America. My administration will always stand with the men and women of law enforcement.
To talk more about President Trump's acceptance speech in the 2020 race, we're joined by historian Rick Perlstein. Over the last 20 years, Perlstein has written 4-volume series on the rise of the modern conservative movement. The final volume, just published, it's titled Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Rick Perlstein. Can you talk about the tropes, the language that President Trump used last night, but go beyond his speech last night and talk about what you see happening to the Republican Party right now? Would you say last night was just a celebration of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think that that's a very hard conclusion to avoid. Adolf Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, used to say it's easier to get the public to believe a big lie than a small one. And what he meant was, if you create such a all-encompassing, completely dominating picture of the world that bears no resemblance to reality, people might think that it's inconceivable that that could be false, right? And that's exactly what we've seen this week in the Republican convention. And the idea that this is happening while basically a young man who amounts to a stochastic terrorist, that's basically a person committing political acts of violence, believing to be inspired by the acts and wishes of a leader, has happened, is something that you cannot separate from what we saw on our screens. This young man is an impassioned Trump supporter, an impassioned police supporter. He goes to Trump rallies. He goes online and presents videos, believing himself to be an armed vigilante protecting the nation against these dark and frightening hordes. He comes to Kenosha, and every terrorist believes or claims to believe that they're protecting something, that they're protecting order. This young gentleman goes around with the support of the police, who hand him water from their riot tanks, and he shoots. He's fleeing. People are trying to disarm him, and his first instinct is to shoot another person in the head, acting basically in line with not the things that a white supremacist Nazi writer of pamphlets says, but the things that the president of the United States does. And the picture that we're looking at, of course, bears careful and thoughtful resemblance to the world that the Republican Party made over the last 40 years. But to understand it, we need to go back to the history of strongmen, going back to a Mussolini, going back to a Hitler.
Johns Hopkins University professor Narges Badrogli wrote on Twitter last night, having studied production of propaganda in history and present for years, poring over endless hours dissecting how it works and looking for when it works well, the RNC convention past 3 days has been some of the best produced and most effective propaganda I've seen, she said. Rick Perlstein.
Yeah, I think that it's effective in the sense that it's going to really motivate people who are within this kind of phony worldview, the one in which, the coronavirus is referred to in the past tense, and America's, economy is the most awesome dynamo the world has ever seen. But of course, in order to win, he needs to reach beyond that and, win the majority of electoral votes. But by the same token, I've made an absolute commitment not to talk about the election of Donald Trump and his attempt to retain power only by talking about voters and electoral votes, because he's appealing so adamantly to the kind of people who will take up arms in the streets if he loses. One of the things we need to understand when it comes to the history of authoritarian strongmen is they're so lawless, and their janissaries and enablers are so lawless that they know that if they lose, they may well be called to account for their breaking of the laws. And that makes it an absolute desperate imperative that they not lose. And that's when you see the most frightening developments. The idea that you cannot allow elections to stand. That's what we saw in Chile in 1970. They lost an election, and that's when they, bombed the presidential palace, right? That's in 1973 when they bombed the presidential palace, but that's when they seized the generals seized power by force of arms, because they knew that were they to lose, they would be held responsible for the crimes that they'd committed.
So, Rick, I wanted to go back to the Democratic National Convention last week, centering on the voices of anti-Trump Republicans, but sidelining progressive Democrats. I mean, like AOC, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yes, she spoke for 60 seconds. She took 90 seconds, but she actually wasn't invited by the DNC. She was invited by Bernie Sanders to nominate him.
Yeah, I want to give it a mixed review. It's absolutely true that they let, the former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, a Republican, and someone who did things like sign laws to allow guns in bars and was a very adamant, pro-life activist. But they let him bait the left wing of the party, which was an absolute absurdity. But at the same time, they really kind of went all in on a lot of this, on a lot of those nights, for Black Lives Matter. And they had an unbelievably galvanizing segment about the imperative to let dreamers stay in the United States. And they had a great segment, about feminism, right? So it was really this attempt to kind of create this big tent. But at the same time, does the highlighting of these Republicans cause such a contradiction that the American people say to themselves, well, what does this party really believe? And it's absolutely scandalous that the younger generation of Democrats, who are, after all, organizing quite effectively to push aside very long-term incumbent congressmen, were slighted.
Rick Perlstein, this last minute we have, and we'll have you back to talk more about Reaganland, but take us back. You have been chronicling the rise of the conservative and Republican Party for decades now, wrote 4 books on it. Take us to Reaganland and the similarities you see, Reagan, Trump, and how Trump has taken it further.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out ways to express these very subtle similarities and differences. And one thing I'll say right now is that Ronald Reagan would definitely say 2 + 2 = 5, right? There's no question about it. But when he would say things like that, it tended to be the off-the-cuff stuff, not the stuff that his speechwriters had written, right? Whereas when Donald Trump takes a podium and he's reading a speech, that's when he lies the most adamantly. And it shows that the kind of lying, deception, propaganda, authoritarianism is qualitatively more systematic than under Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, that it would not have been possible without Ronald Reagan and the movement around him kind of priming the Republican electorate and Republican elected officials for this kind of lawlessness and viciousness.
And you, of course, say that Reagan was one of the most dangerous presidents in U.S. history.
There's no question, right? I mean, whether a guy cuts, 80% out of the public housing budget in 8 years, as Ronald Reagan did with a smile or a scowl, the effect is the same, right? And one of the most dangerous things that Ronald Reagan did as president was something we saw all over in this Republican convention, which is that idea that people who criticize America are not quite Americans, right? That is the Reagan legacy, not only to America, but to the United States. And that's something that is completely unquestioned in the Republican Party.
Well, Rick Perlstein, I want to thank you so much for being with us, author of 4-volume series on the rise of the modern conservative movement. The final book just published, Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 80.